So this topic is an immense one, and one that I will certainly not be able to fully do justice to. So I just want to get that out of the way right off the bat, that there's so much nuance when it comes to speaking about breaking identification with form, with the body. And so that's an important thing to just get out the way off the bat. But I also want to start this by saying that there is a deep, at least what I have found in my own experience, is that there is a deep paradox that exists here. Because to disidentify with form is not a conceptual thing. It is not an intellectual understanding. It's not a disidentifying with form is not believing a thought that I am not the body. So if there's a thought that arises that I am not the body, that I am not form, and that thought is believed, that is not what I'm talking about here. Because that's just another thought. That's just belief of another thought. The disidentification with form happens at a much deeper, much more fundamental level than thought. And the deep paradox that I found that exists here is that is true disidentification with form. So not just the belief of a thought that I am not form, that form doesn't exist, that I am not the body, because that's just believing a thought. That the deep paradox is that one must deeply go into form, must deeply inquire into the nature of form, into the nature of what it means to be in body. And so there is a deep somatic self-inquiry that occurs in the true disidentification with form, a deep somatic inquiry. So it means going deeply into sensation, going deeply into what it means to be in body, and only through that does the identification, the layers, the secret layers of identification with form, with what it means to be in body, only through that direct inquiry does that disidentification occur. So it's the same as on like a mind level, disidentification with mind, with the content of the mind, which would be thoughts. So disidentifying with thoughts is that one must deeply inquire into the nature of mind, must deeply go into thought, there must be a deep awareness cultivated around thought. There must be a, not quite sure the word that I'm looking for here, let's see if it comes. There must be a deep discernment cultivated around inquiring into the nature of mind in order to disidentify from the content of mind. And in the same way, there must be a deep discernment, which means a moving toward, paradoxically, what it means to be in form, what it means to be in body, in order for those strands of identity, of identification with body as what I am, that I am the body, in order for it to be seen that in fact I am not the body, that in fact form is empty. So this is not an intellectual inquiry. There are aspects and elements of using the intellect here, of course, but this, in my experience at least, has been a highly somatic inquiry. Going directly into sensation. And only through that can it be seen that, in fact, sensation, the experience of sensation, the arising of sensation, does not in fact mean that a body actually exists. That what you are is the body, and that's a deep inquiry. That's a deep stage of this process. And so for many, I found this in myself, for many, perhaps there have been ways that you have unknowingly been inquiring into the nature of form, into sensation for quite some time. And that's what I eventually realized in myself, was that through practices such as yoga, such as TRE, such as somatic experiencing and Feldenkrais, and even in plant medicine ceremony spaces, in therapeutic, like psychotherapeutic modalities such as brain spotting and EMDR, all of those types of things. There's many others. There's so many somatic modalities, but through the inquiry into those types of modalities and the practicing of those modalities, unbeknownst to you perhaps, there is an inquiring into form, into being in body, and there is a reorganization happening of secret unconscious belief patterns, because we inevitably grow up having certain beliefs about what it means to be in body through our conditioning, our childhood conditioning, through our engagement with our family of origin, through our engagement with the world, through the relationship that we cultivate with the sensations that we feel in our body. And many, especially those that have a trauma background, end up numbing sensation, deeply disengaging from sensation from the body. And that's not the same thing. That is not disidentifying from the body. That is that's actually deep identification with form. That is a deep pushing away, a deep avoidance. And avoidance is not the same thing as disidentification, because the avoidance has to be dropped. The resistance to sensation has to be dropped. Because what's eventually seen is that sensation, so there's, I remember this came up earlier as this topic suddenly just kind of like popped into my awareness. I remembered a circumstance. So when I was living in Florida for a while, and one of my good friends down there, he and I would just have conversations about, spiritual matters, the nature of emptiness, and just kind of like philosophical types of discussions. So he came up to me one day when I was doing some work on his land, and just kind of asked me, he's like, what do you think comes first, thought or emotion? And I remember sitting with this for a moment, and I was like, and this is funny to look back on, because I didn't have I didn't have an awareness of just like the truth and just like what ended up coming through at that moment. But I sat with it for a moment. I was like, I think it's neither. I feel that sensation is what comes first. And then thought and like emotion is just a label that gets put on top of sensation, and then we can have a thought about sensation or make a story about the meaning of sensation. And I look back at that and I'm like, wow, that's, there was deep truth in that, even though I didn't really realize the depth of that at the time. And so really that's the crux of this, is that there is, like, there is only sensation. There are only the sense gates. I hear people talk about the sense gates, or the just like the sensory apparatus, but there is only sensing. There is only sensing. And then there's thought that gets layered over the sensing. Thought that to see this, to see what appears to be a hand, means that this is mine. It gets, there's a, what's the way I want to say this? There's a claiming of this as mine. And this seeing coupled with sensation creates the appearance of physical form, the appearance of being in body. But all that can be known is the sensing. Everything else is just thought that gets layered on top of that into, and so there is an aspect to this of disidentifying with thought. But this goes so much deeper, because what I have found is that energetic stamps, like which you might label emotions, or sensations that are challenging, or sensations that there's like conditioning layered on top of, that creates resistance to the sensation, is that what happens is that those certain energetic stamps, certain, call it emotions, certain energetic textures, there's a resistance pattern created. And so part of true disidentification with form, with being in body, with being a body, happens on actually an energetic level. So it's not just thought. It's seeing through resistance patterns that are quite subtle, or even dropping resistance to resistance patterns, which is quite the conundrum. Dropping resistance to resistance patterns. So there's like so many, it's just layers, and it's funny. So what's seen at some point is that the sense of I, the sense of self, is nothing but layers. And it's wonderful, like pretty spectacular architecture. So the disidentification with form happens at a very deep level, and there will still be aspects of thought around it, like believing that I am a body. But then there's energetics around it too, where there can be a sensation that arises, and then a resistance pattern to that sensation that holds it away. And it's through going into sensation and meeting, contacting. I've talked about this in a recent video. I can't remember the name of it. I remember I was wearing a green beanie, so look for that video if you want to hear more about that. But there's through the contacting of sensation, those resistance patterns become illuminated, and the identification with form is challenged, or the ways that you might be identified with form, with being a body, with being in a body, become illuminated, become challenged. So practices, embodiment practices and somatic practices, such as yoga, such as TRE, such as Feldenkrais, such as somatic experiencing, such as vagus nerve techniques, such as brain spotting, EMDR. There are endless ways. So it's the exploration, what I found, the exploration of those somatic practices and getting one deeply in touch with sensation and the nuance of sensation is what begins to bring forth those deep layers of identity with form, with body. And so the slight, I guess, turnaround perhaps, or the slight shift in context though that occurs when one is inquiring into the nature of identification, being identified with form. And what I mean by that is that there's a belief held that I am the body, that I am this body, that I am form, like what I am fundamentally is this body. So that's the belief that is being broken down here. But the slight context shift is that those types of modalities are inquired into and are explored not to further grasp onto form and body, but rather to see through layers of identification with it. So, looking back, that's something that I see like in my exploration of all these somatic practices over years and years, in many ways created new identification. So just as an example that I noticed in my own kind of journey is I've been practicing yoga for a number of years. And I started practicing yoga, long before there was an awareness of an interest in self-realization or non-duality, whatever you'd like to call it. And so through the practice of yoga, what happened was there was such a deep disconnection from sensation and from the body, is that practice then created a deeper identification with it. And there was such a focus in yoga on breath that there became unknowingly, a deep identification with breath. Because in yoga, there's part of what's instilled is conscious control of the breath. And so there was a deep identification with being in control of the breath, that the breath was mine, that there was a claiming of it, a claiming of the body, which was simply, looking back, was simply just part of my own process. But then as things got deeper, particularly with beginning to explore TRE, or trauma release exercises, like that was a really powerful modality for me, and was actually, I would say, really one of the things that kicked off disidentifying with the body. It broke the identification with being the one who was controlling the body. There was a belief that I was controlling the body, that the body was mine. And through practicing TRE, because there's what that modality does is it facilitates an involuntary shaking response, was that there was a very clear experiencing and a very clear seeing that, like, oh, I'm not in control of the movements that are happening now. I'm not actually in control. So that was really profound and very powerful for me. And then, the further that I've gotten in the more I've engaged with somatic practices, like having the awareness, like a deeper awareness of kind of having an orientation towards discovering the truth of what I am, like the fundamental truth of what I am, and coming to align with that truth and coming to paradoxically embody that truth. As those practices have been engaged in, they have unveiled layers of identification with form, with the body. So part of the wonderful paradox of awakening is that the movement of transcendence is kind of moving beyond belief in so it's almost like moving into formlessness, seeing the essence of formlessness. And then there's a movement back into form, but it's without identification to form. So it's freely allowing sensation to arise, and that requires moving deeply into sensation, moving deeply into those emotions and those areas and those sensations that we have unknowingly pushed away or held at arm's length. So what I have found is that, or at least what I've seen in things like non-duality, in spirituality, is that there seems to be a favoring of one, kind of like one school over the other, either like form or formlessness, as like this is the path. But in truth, there's a marrying of the two, is that there's a formlessness, so one has to move into formlessness and then move back into form, and one side without the other is inevitably incomplete. So there's a way that different identities will attach either to form or formlessness as the way, but both are required, which is wonderful. So whichever one you find yourself attached to, formlessness or form, it's likely that the counter, the other, is where your work is. So if you're attached to I am not this, or neti neti, or Advaita, Vedanta, or if you are attached to yoga and embodiment, likely your work is going to be in moving into the other, and in that way challenging who you believe yourself to be. So that's all I have.